Okay, it looks like we're 1 minute past the hour. Thank you guys for joining. Welcome to the ROI of Logistics Flexibility. We're so excited to have you joining us today. I'm Vidya Narayanan and I lead product marketing at Flexe. I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined today by two panelists, Jordan Lawrence and George Lawrie, who will also be participating in today's webinar. Jordan, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, certainly. Pleasure to be here with everybody. Jordan Lawrence, Director of Logistics Strategy. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. I serve as a resource for our clients to provide data-driven insights that really drive purchasing decisions in warehousing, distribution, and fulfillment. I have 13 years experience in supply chain, end-to-end manufacturing, distribution, transportation, as well as experience doing consulting on the business system side, ERP, and WMS.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. And George.
Thanks, Vidya, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you. I'm George Lawrie. I'm Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. I'm to be based in London in the United Kingdom. And I've got about a 30-year experience in logistics and operations research. And in fact, I'm particularly interested in supply network and supply network optimization, because my very first job when I finished graduate school was to sit and plan the center of gravity for demand and to lease trucks and warehouses for a 3-year period. I think people would find that ridiculous now when you see how volatile demand is and how much you need to be able to flex that supply network as demand changes. I supported the total economic impact study that we did on behalf of Flexe, and I will be explaining that and what we did and what our findings were later on in this session. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Jordan. We're so excited to have you here today. So really quickly, thank you all for joining. We're really excited to have this discussion this morning. You all are here right now because the market is really turbulent. We're here to talk about some of those challenges you're facing and talk about some new ways to approach and solve some of those. We're so excited to have George here from Forrester as part of that discussion. Like he mentioned, he's going to take us through the total economic impact study that Flexe commissioned, where we can learn about how companies like yours use Flexe logistics programs to solve some of those toughest challenges. And what the final financial impact of really using Flexe programs is. At the end, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. All of you should have a chat button at the bottom of your screen. So as you have questions, we do welcome them. Please submit them, and we should get to those at the end. So let's get started. Okay, you all know this, global supply chains are in crisis. We are in a unique moment in time. Supply side disruptions are hitting every single link of the supply chain, from manufacturing shutdowns and delays to ocean carriage capacity constraints and port congestions to chassis shortages, all the way to final mile delivery reliability and price increases. Every mode and node is experiencing unprecedented stress, things that we just had not seen before. All of this is bumped up against massive demand side volatility, where e-commerce grew the same amount in 10 weeks as it did in 10 years due to COVID-19. Consumer demand patterns are dynamic, making inventory stocking strategies difficult and more challenging than ever before. And there is no end in sight. Jordan, there's a lot going on right now. What's your take on all of this? What makes today's challenges unlike those of the past?
Yeah, thanks, Vidya. So, I thought it'd be helpful just to kind of step back and take a look at the macroeconomic landscape. And, I'm really just going to speak to a few things that everyone in the audience is experiencing at some level. So, the macroeconomic assessment, we've got the supply, demand, and labor pieces of the economy and what's going on. So on the supply side, sub 5% industrial space availability, it's a record low. And if you look at major markets like Southern California or in the Northeast, it's actually sub 2%. So very constrained supply. On the demand side, we have really a pull forward of a trend that was already in place. So with e-commerce demand, this was a trend that was happening well prior to COVID, but perhaps 10 years of that trend was pulled forward very suddenly, which is jarring when you talk about fixed networks and the supply chain. But I think the biggest story is still the labor side, and labor, of course, is affecting the supply side, the demand side, and every link in the chain, whether it's trucking, distribution, manufacturing, or the ports. Really interesting chart I saw recently was labor force participation, which if you look at that metric over COVID, it fell off a cliff, and there was an expectation of a bounce back that would happen post-COVID. But I think what we're all finding is that whether it's baby boomers that took retirement or people that have changed their lifestyle entirely, there has not been an acute recovery from what was a very dramatic shift. And so that is still today the biggest story and the thing that we hear most when talking to supply chain executives.
Yeah, George, what's your take on all of this? Which of these are here to stay? Is any of this getting better in the near future?
Actually, one of the things that interested me in our data, we have a big consumer panel actually all over the world, and we survey these people every quarter. We found out how much more impatient they are. They used to be impatient, but they're way more impatient now. There's no question of, I'll have it next week, or I'll have it in 2 days, or even tomorrow. Many of them in major metropolitan areas, when they order something online, they want it within 60 minutes. So the model has kind of moved away from, let's say, catalog store fulfillment to pizza delivery. I think that's what everything should be.
Yeah.
When you imagine how hard that is, and it's what's driving micro fulfillment and everything around that.
Jordan, yeah, that's great input, George. That's true. And Jordan, with all of this going on, what challenges do you see brands and retailers really facing as a result of this?
Yeah, so just to reiterate, I love George's analogy with the pizza delivery. So I've got another analogy. What we have seen is that the consumer behavior side, I think this is a story that's perhaps not talked about enough, is that ease of switching, which means brand loyalty and also retailer loyalty, has come down dramatically. And of course, the pursuit of omnichannel retail has made this even easier, but I love the, even though maybe it's hyperbole, toilet paper analogy. When we were out of toilet paper, I don't think me or anybody else was particularly concerned about the brand or the retailer where they got that from. They just wanted to fulfill that need. And so really Amazon has driven this as well with their whole catalog of brandless products. And so the reaction that we're seeing and what we're hearing all the time, the reaction to this change in consumer behavior is to increase safety stocks, the desire to increase safety stocks. There has been little success in doing that thus far due to the constraints we just talked about, but also the desire to get closer to the consumer. And that can be both in the B2C side with e-commerce fulfillment, but also B2B, store replenishment. Again, things that folks who were never used to prior to COVID or empty shelves. And now I had a colleague of mine send me a picture today in Michigan of a pharmacy shelf, and everything was totally wiped out. And here we are, well post-COVID. So the behavioral changes to react to these are coming. We hear the lip service. It's very challenging to make those changes, is what we're finding.
Yeah, so keeping products in stock is more critical than ever because the switching cost is just so much easier. George, what are you seeing? What strategies do you see brands, retailers kind of employing to try to keep their products in stock?
Yeah, it's interesting that Jordan talked about safety stock, because I think one of our clients that I noticed had really good availability, even of things like rice and milk powder and so on. I knew that they had very sophisticated demand management. They'd implemented an AI solution. And I asked them, was it, this very clever algorithm? And they said, no. They said what the algorithm did do, it told us that there was an anomaly, and it prompted people to go and bump up safety stock. Now they said, yeah, you can do that. You can bump up the safety stock, but if everybody's doing that everywhere, actually that's one of the things that creates shortages, why there's a shortage of everything. It's also, historically, if people push up safety stock, it's historically quite difficult to get it down again. So my colleagues in China, who are a little bit ahead of us, I think, in recovery from this, they told me to watch out for that. They said, you know, you'll have a huge burst of demand, and then there'll be less demand, and then there'll be excess inventory. So we've seen a little bit of that happening.
Great. Yeah, I love the allusion to, you know, not only is it building up safety stock, but then it's you get there and you're stuck there in a sense, which the whole supply chain bullwhip phenomenon that happens. I mean, we'll talk about that a little more here on the next slide, but certainly an interesting point to make there, George, and maybe looking into the future a little bit as there, you know, right now the stock levels are low, but what happens when stock levels and supply finally does catch up?
Yeah, especially if you're trying to put new products or new product variants or something through that supply chain when it's full of something else. Is the other, maybe it's all in the wrong place. That's the other thing. That we built up the safety stock, but supposing it's not in the right place for where the demand crystallizes. So,
yeah, I think what we've been hearing and what we're kind of touching on is things are crazy right now, and brands and retailers are trying their best to adapt and keep their products in stock and safety stock, and accumulating that stock is a part of it, but it's not enough because it's not always located in the right locations, and supply chains just weren't meant to adapt. They're kind of fixed in nature, fixed in focus, fixed customers, and that's just not the way that our world looks anymore. So I think that sets us up for really kind of talking about the third way that companies can solve problems. And Jordan, I know you had something to say here.
Yeah, so to maybe take a step back and just talk about what are the traditional solutions and what are the value propositions of those traditional solutions. And I'm just going to speak to things that, you know, again, folks in the audience, you already know this, but I think it's important to frame up where we are. On network, ultimately an on network can deliver the best cost solution because there is an additive margin. But the challenges are there's the highest level of CapEx, the highest amount of capital up front is required. And it's also very rigid. So, you know, you create a 2 million square foot box, you have to think about demand many years into the future. So you likely have to over capacity at first and then work your way into that capacity. And it's going to ultimately, you know, building it on network or a new building ground up, or taking on a lease. And that can be anywhere from 6 months to easily 2 years. And so then you take a step away to a slightly more flexible solution, you get 3PLs. And, you know, I think the example I give is that if you need 5 new sites at 1 million square feet apiece, it's very hard to use your internal supply chain team to deploy that. And so 3PLs can help in that sense, and they can deploy all of them simultaneously and work on the business systems integration. And of course, also they're going to amortize some of the costs. So they'll typically give you a 3, 5, 7-year contract, and they will amortize out some of that capital cost, you know, on behalf of the client. Of course, they add margin to the CapEx amortization and then margin to the business, whether it's a cost plus model or a fixed variable model. And then there's programmatic logistics. And programmatic logistics uses networks and technology instead of fixed buildings, fixed assets, fixed leases. So it is an entirely different solution in that sense, that there isn't this large upfront cost. There isn't the rigidity of a single footprint that will be available to you in 2 years' time. It can be available to you in 6 months' time, but also the contract length can be very short. Something I like to point out with this is that, you know, the idea is that programmatic logistics makes owned networks more efficient. It is not a replacement for them. If you want to get the best out of a fixed solution, you want to have a level loaded 85% utilization or something along those lines at all times. You want to avoid dips and big volatility. And so the programmatic logistics approach is to divert the volatility out of your fixed networks, have the best cost solution running at the best possible cost per unit, cost per case, cost per pallet in your fixed network, and then take the volatility out and have flexibility. And, you know, what George talked about with this kind of bullwhip effect, I mean, this cuts both ways. So your fixed network, we have sudden changes in demand and consumer behaviors. And then over a 6 month to 2 year period, you try to adapt your supply chain to that. Meanwhile, demand is still changing. So it can outstrip you, But the other thing it can do is it can pull back, and you end up with overcapacity when you're always caught behind in the reaction. And so programmatic logistics allows you to be a little more in lockstep with the market conditions and hedges the uncertainty out of your fixed network and your CapEx there. So that's kind of a summary of programmatic logistics and how it's used. And the next slide here, we just kind of line out some of the programs that are used. So this is flexible distribution, fulfillment, same-day delivery. It can be things like product launches, where you have a spike in order volume and then a reversion back down to a mean that is very difficult to manage in a fixed network. So these are solutions that are used by Flex clients, retailers, brands. 6 of the 10 largest retailers in the United States use a variety of these solutions. So this is really setting context for the types of solutions that George will unpack here for the rest of the presentation in reviewing the study that was completed by Forrester.
I was thinking, Jordan, about implementing a sales and operations planning process with a CPG. And one of the things that we had to always think about for the promotions was, what limitations do we have on storage space? And I do remember one of the account teams going, why do we have limitations? Then we got into a long story about, well, it's to do with the contract and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, please keep going.
I'm going to turn it over to you, George. Really looking forward to diving into the weeds here. And thanks for everyone for the time on the intro here.
Yeah, so Flex asked Forrester to undertake a study into the value to its clients of this kind of programmatic logistics that we've been talking about. And we used a methodology we call the total economic impact. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that. This is a kind of an extract from the whole presentation. We've been working on this methodology now for about 20 years, and it's based really on the theory of options, so real world options. It's a consistent methodology which we to help people justify technology investment. So CIOs who work with us use it for their internal ones. And yes, of course, it looks at the benefits of a particular technology or an application or an approach. It looks at the costs, but what it tries to do is to factor in risk and also to attach a value to flexibility. So what is the value of being able to, for example, and we just talked about this, to manage peaks and troughs in demand more easily? And this methodology uses real world options to assign that. Let's go on and look at the next slide and see how we did that. This is the headline, really, the 3-year impact based on customer feedback. We quantified the benefit, the cost, the risk, and then we attached some value to the options or flexibility that customers had from this type of approach. And you can see these are really nice, impressive numbers. And what I'm going to do is to take you through, how did we get there? How did we create these numbers? And how could you use this methodology if you wanted to see, would your mileage be different? So your mileage may vary. Let's go on and look at how we got into this. So when we do this, we normally undertake a stage of due diligence in which we try and understand what are the natures of those benefits and costs, and what is that flexibility that we're looking at. We undertake customer interviews and surveys, and then we create a kind of composite financial model. So we take a sample of customers and we kind of, we amalgamate them to create a kind of model company. And then we create the composite financial model for this, and we write up the study case, and we then review the results, and we make them available to the client, in this case Flex, to use for itself and to use with its clients. Please, let's have a look at the next one. So we looked at 4 users and we interviewed and studied them in detail. And as you can see, they're across a variety of different types of businesses. I think it's not surprising that a couple of them are in retail, because retail is the most impacted by this. We already talked about the fact that particularly e-commerce demand is incredibly volatile, and the elasticity of demand there is much higher than the elasticity of supply. But we also see many consumer brands, so electronics brands, but also fashion brands and CPG manufacturers going into a direct-to-consumer business. This is the fastest growing part of business for CPG, and it's really important for them. So they've all seen what Nespresso did, and Nestle leads the world in this. So you can see the type of people that we interviewed. So you can see the roles that we looked at. We can see the sizes of the companies. So from a small one to some very, very large ones. Let's go on and see how we worked with them further. Now, each of them really had a similar set of problems. And the main problem was the one that we talked about right at the beginning, that their customers' expectations had completely changed, that they really were much more impatient than ever they had been before, that they suddenly couldn't afford to meet the scale of this demand from their own capital resources, that they had limited space where they had it, and that there was a lot of, I'd say, complexity and cost around all the different vendors and systems that they had. So many of these people already had multiple vendors in their logistics, multiple warehouse systems. Very hard for them to get a single view of their inventory across all these warehouses and all these warehouse systems. So those were, I'd say, common challenges pretty much to all of them. Let's go on to the next one. And most of them really were thinking about common objectives. So when we created our composite organization to do this aggregate financial analysis, we typified it, or we characterized it as a global business to consumer, retail consumer type firm. We characterized it as having 5 billion global revenues. You can see how that comes as a composite from the 4 examples that we had. And this is important, that the average order value was $100. Now, in our own studies, we look at a lot at this, at the average order value, and what kind of logistics is that going to justify. They had common objectives. One of the things that they were trying to do was to reduce the level of cart abandonment. Many of you will be very well aware of this, that when people start to shop, if it takes too long, they abandon the cart. And we have tons of data about this. What were they doing in terms of the characterization of the use of the Flexe logistics program? You can see here we were looking at the different centers of fulfillment centers they had, and the as needed centers for excess capacity when they had a boom in demand. Let's go on to the next slide. So by adding these additional hubs that we just talked about to their fulfillment networks, and by enabling themselves to have a faster delivery speed, by placing the inventory, we heard about this, closer to the fluctuating demand, and reducing their abandoned cart rates, we were able to see a significant increase in e-commerce revenue. Now, this, when we first calculated this, I thought, this is enormous, this is huge. Until we started checking it against our own data and what people see. And this actually is really the most critical and most interesting bit of our study, that once you're engaged with a network that enables you to deliver much faster to people by putting inventory closer to them, and of course reducing shipping rates, but that's not the important thing. What you're doing is you're increasing the amount of sales that you get from e-commerce. And of course, you're taking that from your competitors, because those people are out there looking to see, where can I get it quickest? And if you're able to fulfill it more quickly, we saw that earlier on, you secured their loyalty, not just this sale, but further sales afterwards. And that's really how we calculated this. So you can see some very pertinent quotations here from some of the people that we interviewed. 15% drop in cart abandonment, 20% increase in e-commerce sales. If you think about what would that be worth, another fifth of e-commerce sales. And why is that? Because in this case, they were looking at less than 3 days. You can see other examples, less than 2 days or even next day. Let's go to the next slide. So the next thing was being able to flex that network to get a new location up very, very quickly. Now, we already talked about the fact that the pattern of demand is highly variable, and we've seen it even more volatile during this crisis. So the ability to be able to put up a new location and to do it quickly is one of the things that's really driving this. But it also, I'd say, it enables people to spend less time and effort on doing this. And so we calculated that in as well. Reduced use of 3PL services and saving time basically on managing them. Those of you who've had to manage these contracts know what a lot of time and effort it takes. The other thing I really wanted to pull out of this was the visibility into the whole distribution and fulfillment network. We've seen this over and over again, that if you have different 3PLs, if you have different, even in your own company, different warehouse management systems, you won't necessarily be able to take that urgent demand and be able to syndicate it just where you need to in order to keep that customer satisfied. So this access to a whole network and the visibility, transparency across it without having to manage extra people, very, very valuable, at least according to the people that we talked about here. Oh, somebody just popped up a question there about, did this increased commerce sales, did it take into account cannibalization of store sales? Actually, this was because the example here was a B2C operation. We didn't consider point of sale because it wasn't a conventional retailer that we were modeling here. Okay, let's go on to this next one, which we talked about reduced warehouse costs. We're also able to, I'd say, reduce the cost relative to the 3PLs because of using the space better. Why? Because we were able to see what we're doing here more easily, more transparency, and also because you don't have the fixed contract that you have with the 3PL. So you can see here some reduction in expense. Let's go on to the next one. And also some reduced transportation costs, because we just talked about this. We're putting the inventory much closer to people. And that's the great thing about being able to spin up your capacity and being able to allocate the order to the place that's closest to the customer. So reduction in last mile transportation costs, actually pretty modest in our estimation here. I suspect probably if we look more at the data, we could have made that a little bit more. But this is the challenge of trying to get it to people very quickly, to expedite it, but also to place it really close to them. Yeah, and the other thing is using the same software across the whole network. And we talked about how important that is in terms of visibility, but also some reduced costs around it. Let's go on to the next slide. And finally, there were benefits that the interviewees that we talked to couldn't really quantify it. But I suspect that some of these non-quantifiable ones are really quite important. So there's speed to launch new centers, we talked about that. The centralized technology platform, we talked a bit about that. And yeah, the peace of mind that you have for having predictable operating costs. I think that's the thing that's very worrying if you have a business that has high fixed costs and very variable demand. It's hard to sleep because you don't know, am I going to be able to meet those fixed costs next month? Whereas if you manage to make them more, let's say, operating costs more variable, then you're in a much better place. Let's go on to the next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, George, for taking us through all of that. I know today's discussion, we've sort of talked about, okay, supply chains are unlike we've ever seen before. And as a result of that, retailers, brands, manufacturers are facing the set of challenges unlike they've ever experienced. Jordan took us through what a programmatic approach kind of does. And this was a great summary of how companies already use Flexe today in a programmatic approach to really improve customer experiences and save money by taking out some of the volatility in their networks. So curious, I guess I have a question for you both. Given the unique market context and what people are kind of going through, what organizations are facing today, how can companies start thinking about using logistics programs as an approach in today's market context?
Guess I will. I'll jump in on that, Vidya. So, to me, and the point that we made at the outset here is really, in a lot of ways, about hedging future outcomes. There is maximum uncertainty. The speed at which you're going to deploy new fixed resources is going to be slow, and the changing dynamics with the port and the flow of goods. It's just very volatile right now, and so the dynamism needed to react with that and to not over allocate on the cost front. Listen, there's plenty of things that people are doing that are adding costs. Everyone's costs are going up, whether they're air freighting to get in stock, whether they're paying more at every link in the transportation chain. Everyone's costs are going up. So mitigating some of the long-term CapEx, which is going to really blow budgets out, that's exceptionally important right now. So that's, we could go in a lot of different directions with that question, but I think that's an important point.
Well, Jordan, there's always something at this time of year. There's the run up to Black Friday and to the holiday sales. People will be thinking, yeah, how am I going to manage that? Do I have to, lease extra warehouse space, or what should I do? And will it materialize? Will this demand actually, and will there be any stuff, or will it be still sitting in one of those ships off Long Beach? All that kind of uncertainty. I'm sure that people must be thinking, great if we had some way of spinning this up and being able to mitigate it a little bit, so at least there was one thing that we didn't have to worry about.
Yeah, certainly an interesting question. We have been threatened with everything being stocked out for Christmas this year. We'll see if that materializes. I saw the question in the chat about Black Friday capacity. Yes, it's the seasonal capacity play is one, and this is usually in the form of e-commerce fulfillment. We see that very commonly. A lot of times it's non-sortable, bulkier product, simply because bulky product, a lot of times this is associated with seasonal sales, but it also, again, looking back at your fixed network, it's these large, bulky products that really cause inefficiency when you're trying to pick fast-moving sortable goods. And so a lot of the seasonal stuff that we see supporting Black Friday, that's kind of the sweet spot that we see frequently utilized, is taking non-sortable product out of that fixed network, running a seasonal play, knowing that you're not going to continue to buy and hold inventory at the levels that you hold to support Q4 for the rest of the year. So it fits the programmatic model very nicely.
Yeah, because a lot of retailers have typically, they've optimized when they have their own facilities, they've optimized them for that e-commerce fast pick. But it's normally a kind of one. It's not a great big tree or something of that nature.
Yes, and we've certainly seen the Christmas trees. We've handled a number of those through the Flex networks. Fake trees up to this point, not real ones.
I think this discussion actually sets us up nicely for some of the questions that we've received in the chat. So I'm just going to dive in. One of the questions we got was, with agility to react to demand and finding sources outside of traditional suppliers, increasing inventory levels, et cetera, and prices and lead times go up. At one time, do you anticipate an adjustment to budgets and margins compared to forecasts? End of fiscal year, 2 to 3 years from now, kind of how should companies be looking at that?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, I think this is the $1 million question: is there margin compression, or are costs passed through to consumers, and to what degree do consumers absorb that cost? And that is the $1 million question for a lot of brands and retailers. The data that we see, the economic data, outside of supply chain right now is really showing that yes, consumers are absorbing that cost, and so we're not necessarily seeing the price compression. And I think all of those things are going to go into budgets. Obviously, budgets are going to increase. Kind of dovetail that to the other question about automation. This is the opportunity to be more efficient in the supply chain, and that does deserve a degree of CapEx. And so, I think that most executives are going to understand allocating larger budgets to their supply chain is a necessity moving forward.
And let's dive into another one. And George, this might be a good one for you. Where is the bottleneck in the supply chain that caused the problem right now?
Well, I think, if you look at what's happened with the ports, it's not for me to comment on this, but it's mostly institutional. That, for example, at Long Beach, they don't allow owner-operators. So you've immediately cut down the number of people who can go and pick these things up. The second thing, and we published a little bit on this, is that it's about the dwell time of the containers. That the containers come, and it's the same in Europe, they come from the Far East to Europe, and they come from the Far East to the United States. And then particularly the consolidators are hoping to have something to put in them going back. And generally speaking, they haven't been able to do that. And so the containers are sitting there. And now you're getting this whole thing of a container imbalance, that there's more containers here than there are there. And I think, Vietnam had very bad COVID, but once they recovered, they all wanted to go back to work. There weren't enough containers there for them to send anything. So you've got that kind of problem going on as well.
Yeah, it's really difficult to pinpoint the exact location. If you talk to people at GM, the broader story is chips. So you just think about auto supply chains. The broader story is chips. The reality is it's all of the parts manufacturers are all facing the same constraints, the inbound logistics to the manufacturing plants. There's so many points of challenge. It's very hard to pinpoint, what is the one thing. And then the other backdrop is demand. Demand is still at record levels. I think a recent report came out and said, the ports are still processing record quantities of containers. It's just the demand is outstripping even that. So a lot going on. It's very challenging to pinpoint.
There's a lot of inflationary pressure in the economy generally. You've got, monetary easing, and you've got fiscal policies. And it's, again, my Chinese colleague was very funny about that. He said, we didn't have any furlough here, George. He said, when they didn't go to work, they didn't get paid. He said, it's very different for you in Europe and in the US. So of course your demand is still high. He said, our problem was no demand afterwards because people are trying to rebuild their savings.
This is great conversation. And actually we're getting a lot more questions. So I'm going to ask this one, and I think it's very interesting. So I'm interested to see both of your takes on this. DCs are retrofitting and investing in automation and robotics to counter labor issues. And we talked about those issues earlier on today. That's a lot of big CapEx investment. How do they remain agile to react to market conditions when they're kind of locked down in these long-term investments that are really expensive?
And the worrying thing is that the DCs were put there by people doing that calculation that I used to do. Yes, the center of gravity for demand for the whole of the Southwest is here. Except, well, what happens if it isn't the center of gravity demand? What happens if it changes? So I understand why they're doing it. It's just, to me, it's sort of risky because you've concentrated your risk in that based on that old calculation. And given that demand is much more volatile than supply, that does kind of worry me. I don't know, what do you think about that, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift to automation is very real. Just to give the Flex or maybe just my perspective on this is that when we look at the 1,000+ operators in the Flex network, we actually find that there is still a dramatic lack of automation, robots, and there's a lot of very difficult manual tasks that are done by labor. And that's the feedback that we see when they're trying to find employees for these warehouses, is that the hard labor is not something they want to do. So bringing goods to people, reducing the travel times, reducing the heavy lifting, without a doubt, that is the trend. And you look at people on the forefront of this, like Gap Old Navy, for example, saw a piece on their warehouses, highly automated, every link in the chain. So that trend is going to continue to march forward. This is kind of feeds back to our budget's going to need to be bigger. Is CapEx going to need to be bigger? Yes, it is really the only solution. And I think that the context for Flex is that there are things that require automation, fast, high throughput sortable products. And there are things that require less automation. Again, maybe using the non-sortable, large, bulky product. You want to get that out of the way of your robot so you can efficiently deal with totes and sortable pick, pack, ship operation. So this is a place where Flex finds making automation work in the warehouse. The Flex programs are going to divert the things that make that more complicated, allow you to streamline a highly automated fixed solution, and then just simply take the demand overrun out of the equation so you can level load those robots. If you have robotics, if you have heavy capital costs, you need to have as much production out of that capital as possible, which means you don't need downtime. Downtime is the enemy of these capital or highly capital intensive robotics. So Flex complementing that, taking the volatility out of the supply chain, that's kind of our approach to robotics. And there is a future for robotics and Flex as well, even though I can't completely comment on that at this time.
Just one thing on that, John, you're exactly right about move the goods to the people, and don't have people walking around a lot, don't have them toting heavy stuff. But one client we worked with, they had AI to choose the right box or the right shipping container to minimize the shipping cost. That was fine. But what they wanted people to make it look nice. They were very keen, first of all, on people doing a better job on the substitutes than they could do by automatically picking. But secondly, they wanted people to make that box look nice when people opened it. And I thought that was a really nice combination of some automation, some human. So we see a lot of pick to light to help them with the volume, that kind of thing. But we also see a lot of, well, what do people do better than machines? So I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, just one comment on another question here. It says, our greatest struggle is not shortage of labor, but instead keeping that workforce busy, right? If you don't have work and people don't get their time card, they leave you, and then you have this problem of hiring and losing. And that's a real challenge, certainly something that we see and that everyone sees. There are more applications, again, Gapple Navy had a piece of this recently, using Uberization of the labor force. They use that as their primary, I'm not going to say what the name of the application is, but you can find it. They use that as their primary means to bring on labor, and people can select to work for 4 hours. They can select to work any amount they want. And then, the shipper provides incentives. Hey, we need dedicated people for a week. There's a bonus if you stay with us for 7 straight days, things like that. And so, these flexible labor models, definitely critical. This is, I think that's a really good point, that it's not just about obtaining labor, it's about maintaining that labor. And it's certainly something we see.
Yeah, and actually just a quick follow-up comment on that, Jordan. I think this is also a great application of the Flex business model, where if you have a steady stream of business, that it makes sense to have a fixed amount of labor to support, but then you have peaks in your business that require scaling labor. Maybe it's a good idea to think of using Flex or a model like Flex, a flexible logistics model, where you can actually outsource some of those peaks and not pay for labor and capacity for the whole 12-month period. I think that's a great application of the Flex model too. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We have a question around transportation, which I know was a section that was covered in our TEI study. There's a lot of demand driving increases in transportation, as we all know and see, and that's a big contributor to current issues. What are the alternatives and that's the question. So I think what I'm understanding is what are the alternatives to bringing down my transportation costs? How can I kind of think about that outside of the regular carriers? What's the approach there?
A really relevant question. Transportation, of course, is the biggest cost for e-commerce. I mean, we talked a lot about cost within the 4 walls, but the reality is when you look at your cost allocations and your COGS there, it's the transportation piece that's carrying the bulk of those costs, maybe 5 times more than or more than your fulfillment costs. So a really interesting question. One of the strategies we see is that a lot of times as transportation availability comes as more important than pure cost play. So Flexe has transportation contracts. And, when we talk to Fortune 500 companies, we often are not going to be the more price competitive solution. Their own contracts are the most highly negotiated contracts, and they come at very good discounts. But Flex uses both alternative transportation providers, non-traditional parcel, as well as traditional parcel. And a lot of times it's about diversifying those contracts. So if there is a quota or a cap on the owned contract, run up to that cap and get the best cost, and then use, whether it's Flex or somebody else, use another transportation contract to handle that overrun. And, it's about diversifying, and, no one knows exactly who's going to be the tightest when it comes to things like parcel capacity and LTL and truckload capacity going into Q4. So diversity is king. Having your own network and then having a secondary network, very important.
Yeah, and there's a few things like this. There are on-demand services. So one of them that I went on, it was a couple of years ago, and they said, pull out your credit card, go to this URL. There you go. You just bought yourself a full truckload from Dallas to Atlanta or whatever it was. And it was easy to do. But I've got to say, I talked to shippers and I talked to carriers about this. And I said, what do you think? And they said, it's going to be a kind of top up. They said, most of the shippers have contracts with people that they know, and they want to go on using them because they want that level of reliability. And the same thing with the carriers, especially the ones who own their own vehicles. They can't Uberize themselves. I mean, yeah, they might do it on top of their normal contract, but they can't do it instead of. So I think you're right, really, about that, Jordan.
Yeah, and some of it's just the traditional thing. If you have owned transportation assets, make sure they're fully utilized, and then go into the brokerage space. I spent plenty of time in brokerage. The reality is you're going to pay spot market rates. It's going to be more expensive, but there is a price at which you can procure transportation. So it's just a matter of, does it eat all your margin or not? And having that diversification is critical.
Yeah. And there are people who are crowdsourcing last mile, that kind of thing as well. Sorry.
No worries. This is great conversation, and I think we're getting a lot of really interesting questions. So I want to touch on this one because I know we've talked a lot about the B2C, but in B2B distribution settings, there's large amounts of space that are required for short amounts of time. The question here is, how is Flex business model holding up given the low industry vacancy rates throughout the country, especially in New York and LA?
Yeah, really important question. And I think, size and scale is an important piece of input here. The reality is, if you say right now, I need to go into LA and find 1.5 million square feet of space, it's going to be very challenging no matter who you are. And we're finding that the best strategy is to break that footprint up and use secondary markets. Especially if you're dealing with a smaller market than LA. Let's say we've had the same question. We've had people come to us and say, hey, we're in Savannah and we want to take down 1.5 million square feet of space. Well, the building doesn't exist. So the way Flex uses networks is really twofold. We work with partners that are capable of taking down buildings, and then we consume latent capacity in existing buildings. So there could be a 1.5 million square foot building that has 500,000 square feet available. This is not maybe clear when you look at industrial space availability, because that space appears to be occupied, but there's a cohort of it that's not. And so we look to parse this out, consume 500,000 here, and maybe 500,000 in another market, a secondary market somewhere, maybe not in Inland Empire, but we go north in California, we go Reno area or into Arizona, and try to piece together a solution until the market normalizes enough that you can build that long-term fixed distribution network. I mean, the reality is, if you're looking at multi-million square footprint for high throughput distribution, ultimately this is going to be something where you're going to lean towards an owned network or maybe a 3PL to get you to an owned solution.
Yep, great. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, and we've also received a few questions about getting the recording. So I will say that anyone that has registered for this webinar, you will receive a thank you note for attending. Thank you. And you'll also receive a link to the recording after this. So thanks for asking about that. Okay, one last question, because I know that we have been going pretty long, but I think this is also an interesting one and something that we touched on earlier. And this one I think is for you too, Jordan. We talked a lot about the final mile and parcel costs and controlling costs. This question is, how is Flexe partnered with common parcel last mile carriers to control cost for their clients?
So, we do benefit from having the aggregator effect where we're pulling together multiple clients into a single contract. So, we have specialists that work in our transportation department and negotiate those contracts. We pull together a whole lot of volume across clients. We could have multiple clients in a single multi-tenant facility. And so we're leveraging scale, and that's really the name of the game in transportation. The biggest buyer gets the best rates. And so that's the way we're trying to address that challenge, if I understand the question correctly. I think just one other comment I wanted to make thinking about this B2B question too is that while ultimately large B2B solutions or direct to consumer at a certain scale, you want to own those in-house. One of the things that Flexe does to facilitate that, if we take a multi-facility approach or a single facility approach, is through actually launching that new facility. So a lot of people are breaking ground. They're looking at building a new component of their fixed network, and it's a 1.5-year process. As you get towards completion, the ability to launch a new facility, that is a really difficult process. No new facility launch, both from a system standpoint, logistics execution standpoint, it's just difficult. Things don't go well. And so what Flexe does frequently is mirror that new site. So we'll create a shorter term solution that works hand in hand with that new solution that's going to come online that's owned by our client. And that way, as that new facility comes online, Flexe winds down, their facility winds up. If there's any hiccups, whether they're using robots or just labor issues, they can pull back and they have a release valve. So it's really, a lot of times we're just facilitating the build out of fixed infrastructure as well. And maybe that applies a little bit to the question about B2B distribution as well.
Yep, I think that does tie really closely together. Thank you, Jordan. And I know we are close on time now, so I thought now would be a good time to wrap up. A really great discussion today, guys. George, thank you so much for joining the Flexe webinar today. Hopefully, yeah, thank you. It was wonderful having you and Jordan as well. I think what we've heard today, just to kind of replay it all back and summarize, supply chains are crazy right now. You all know this, we live it, we talked about it. This is creating a ton of unique challenges that we've never really faced before, especially around keeping products in stock, consumers happy, redesigning networks, etc. I think what we discussed and learned today is that there's a new way or third way to approach some of these problems, and that's a programmatic approach. It's proven and it's already used by many Fortune 100 companies today. And as George took us through, the business case is really fantastic. So thank you again, George, for joining us. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. We really enjoyed it. And you will be receiving a recording as well after this. So thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everyone who attended. Really appreciate it. We know that time is something not everyone has a whole lot of luxury extras in. So anyway, appreciate the time today.
Thank you. Thanks all.